Hi, everyone. This is Nina Collins. We're here today doing our weekly recording of Raging Gracefully, which is the podcast for Revel. Our special guest today is Katherine Burns, who you can tell I've known for a long time. Katherine is the longtime director of the Moth. She's the artistic director. She's a producer and frequent host of the Peabody Award-winning Moth Radio Hour, the editor of the international bestsellers Occasional Magic, True Stories About Defying the Impossible, the Moth 50 True Stories. There was another book called All These Wonders, True Stories About Facing the Unknown. She is now one of the co-editors, authors of a book that we're here to discuss today, How to Tell a Story. Wait, there's a little bit more about Katherine's bio because she's kind of amazing. She's also the director of the solo show Helen and Edgar, which opened at the Public Theater in January 2014 as part of the Under the Radar Festival and was called Utterly Absorbing and Unexpectedly Moving by Ben Brantley of the Times. She's done a million things. Prior to the Moth, she directed and produced television and independent films. She interviewed all sorts of people like Ozzy Osbourne and Martha Stewart and Howard Stern. She was born and raised in Alabama, and she lives in Brooklyn. And I have known Katherine for, I think I first met you when my son was a baby. So for pretty much almost 20 years. I used to be on the board of the Moth a million years ago.
Thank you again. You were an early board member.
No, I was an early board member. And Katherine worked with Leah, who was then the artistic director. And then Leah moved on, and Katherine moved up, and she's been running it forever. And you run it with Sarah Burns is still there, right? I mean, not Sarah Burns, sorry, Sarah Haberman. Yes. Sarah Haberman, who I'm very fond of. And it's a great team. And actually on the cover of this book are also women, Meg Bowles, Jennifer Hickson, women I've known forever. So it's a long time core crew of people at the Moth.
And I'm a hardcore wolfer. Yeah, I feel like I was very early on, and now Revel, of course. But yeah, absolutely love it. And as much as I can, I'm part of the community and have attended a lot of events.
Yeah, no, it's really great. We're lucky. I feel like I say this all the time, but I feel like I spend my days talking to interesting women in our demographic, and we are really lucky to have each other. Like, it's
Amen. And to live in the era we're in, where we're sort of owning our own stories and lives in a way that I think is unprecedented.
Yeah. Yeah.
At least in the last 2,000 years. Yeah.
Exactly. And how old are you, Katherine? Remind me.
53.
Okay, we're the same age. I'll be 53 in August.
Oh, yeah.
So let's talk about this book, How to Tell a Story. The Moth, you guys have done a bunch of different books. And for anyone who's listening if you haven't yet listened to The Moth on public radio, or I listen to it on podcasts. I don't even know how it works anymore. It's available all over the place, but I listen to the Moth podcast all the time. And if you haven't listened to it, they're really, really wonderful. And Katherine will correct me if I'm wrong, but the way the shows generally work, they do what's called story slams, which are 5-minute stories. People get up and tell 5-minute stories, and then there's usually a judge. And years ago, I used to judge them sometimes, which was really fun. And then the standard Moth story is under 11 minutes, I believe.
Yeah, it's like we usually say 10 to 12 now, but that's on our main stage, which is our flagship series. And for those, we actually go out and select the storytellers and then work with them pretty extensively on their stories and just help them tell the best story they can.
So story slams, the 5-minute ones, are a little more
open mic. Yeah, they're open mic. Although people come so prepared, and some of the greatest raconteurs the Moth has ever known have come out of those open mic story slams.
Yeah. And so you do podcasts and are there live radio? Is there a live radio show, or is it all podcast now? What's the differentiation?
So there is, we're both a public radio show and a podcast. So we're on, I think we're up to 475 public radio stations around the country. I know, we're also on the BBC. And and that airs every single week, like around the country. And then we podcast all of those radio shows. Then in addition, on our podcast feed, if you sign up anywhere you like to listen to podcasts, we do additional 25 to 26 podcasts a year, where it's just like individual stories that we love. It's like the regular podcast is a little bit more nimble. It can take a long time to produce a radio show. Yeah. But the podcast, like something can happen, or like someone we love has a book come out or something exciting happen, and we can just like boom, pop a story out. And it's the way we communicate with our worldwide community.
Which is amazing. And so then has that really taken over? Talk to us about the live shows. Obviously that must have been impacted by COVID, but what is the live show schedule like and program like these days?
Yeah, we're almost back to normal, which is so amazing. But right before COVID, we were producing, can you believe this, as a former board member, 600 live shows a year.
No.
all
Jeez.
around the world. I know. So it's like they're open mic slams. At the time it was in 30 cities. We actually dropped back to 25 over the course of COVID, but we're in Australia and England. But we actually do a lot of main stage stories across English speaking Africa, because we do a lot of work with the Gates Foundation over there. So actually one of our favorite shows we did during COVID was at the Kenyan National Theater, and then it was just broadcast out and anyone could watch it. So yeah, but it's usually.
How do you do that? And I mean, it seems like the core staff is still the same people that I knew a million years ago, but to be in 25 countries, do you have someone in every country?
No, not 25 countries. I would say 25 cities.
25 cities.
Which is a little bit different, because we're, but we have, I think when you were on the board, there were maybe 5 of us with a lot of volunteers, and now it's closer to 40. We also have part-time staff in every city that we have a regular events in, who know their city, and we really rely upon for so much. But the core staff is pretty much, we're all based in New York City. There's a few of us. Meg, who co-wrote the book, lives in Sweden, and we make that work. But yeah, so but there aren't a ton. People always expect, people often come on the Moth staff and think that there's 100, 150 people, and then there's a staff meeting and there's 40 people, and they're like, oh wait.
How do you do all this? This is pretty incredible. 475 public radio stations, 600 live shows a year. That's huge. And would you say the live shows, which takes up more weight, or is it the same, the recorded shows or the live shows?
I would say it's about the same. So the way we do is we record all the live shows. So almost every single story you hear on the radio show or podcast was recorded in front of a live audience. Of course, during the pandemic, we did these shows over Zoom, but we try, as soon as we could, we at least got the storytellers back in a live venue and then broadcast out to people at home. And now, thank goodness, we're back with live audiences. But so we record all of them live, and then we put the best of all the live shows together into the radio show and podcast. And so it's like an insane amount of listening for our team, that we listen to every single story told. And there's a whole system by which the ones that we think will resonate the most bubble up and end up on the air.
Yeah, that's an interesting question, because of course they can't all be great. And how do you manage that? How do you manage, has managing quality control gotten much harder as you've grown so much? Because there is a real consistency. Again, for those of you listening who don't know the Moth, maybe you all do, but there is a real consistency, which we'll get to when we talk about this book, to the way the stories are told. There's I'd say almost a rigorous, if you really know the Moth stories, you feel it when you're listening to them.
Yeah, I mean, with more stories to choose from, you're going to, I think, generally find better stories. I mean, I guess it could have gone the opposite, where if we just started throwing spaghetti at the wall and doing too much, the story quality would have suffered. But we're lucky now, back in the day, there'd only be one person directing all the mainstay stories. Now we have a team of about 10 directors. And that's nice, because then it's like 10 different people whose opinions, we always say that turning people's lives into art is messy. And it's good to have 10 different people who have 10 different points of view, 10 different sets of interests, backgrounds, worldviews, going out to find the stories that they are going to connect with, because the more diverse our directing team is, of course, the more stories we're going to find. Yeah.
So in fact, what's happened is the stories have gotten richer. They've gotten better, not worse, as you've grown, which is really, I think so.
I really hope so. For me, they have. Yeah.
I mean, I don't listen to them all, but when I listen, I'm consistently always super impressed. Like, I do not feel like the quality from my observation has gone down at all, but it is an interesting question, because it could have.
It could. It's interesting. I was once stuck in this crazy cab with Deborah Dugan. Do you know her? She was also our longtime board chair. And we were talking about how so many of us have been around for a really long time, and how that could have meant that the shows got a little bit stale. But we feel like it's just the opposite, because we're always trying to keep ourselves interested, ourselves engaged. What story have we not heard? Is there a new way to tell a story? Is there a new format that we could take on that would be interesting, that would still kind of keep our heart intact and our values, but that could be a little bit different? Because if, I feel like we've gone through periods where, certainly under my leadership, for instance, I think there was a period in the mid, like around 2005, 2006, where the stories got a little bit after school special. Like, everything was a little bit too wrapped up in a bow. And that was probably me being nervous, because I'd been the artistic director for just a few years. And wanting to have too much control. And I think the stories got better when we let go of that a little bit. Let the ending speak sometimes a little bit. Because life is not all wrapped up in a bow, right? Yeah, and so we had to relax a little bit.
Yeah, that's very cool. Well, let's be clear to everyone who's listening that there are a few kind of rules, basic rules about Moth stories, right? Moth stories are always true and told out loud in the first person. They're not read or recited. They always involve stakes and some sort of transformation, which is one of the parts I have a hard time with personally. Like, how do you always have a transformation? And Moth stories are told within a specific time frame. So those are the kind of 4 pillars to Moth stories that they believe in. And the idea behind this book is that you too could basically have your own personal Moth director, essentially. The book kind of takes you through trying to mine your life for the stories that are perhaps the most tellable, and then kind of helps you learn how to tell it in the best way. Is that a good summary of what this book is?
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, we wrote this book, there, as you know, so many of us, like we've been together almost from the beginning. Like, of the people whose names are on the cover of that book, I think the person who's been at the Moth the least amount of time has been there 12 years, so there's just a wealth of knowledge, that part of which we inherited when some of us came on, but that we've all built together. And there was a real desire, it's our 25th anniversary in a few weeks. And on the brink of that we wanted to put this knowledge down that we've gained, because so many people who, our hope is that somebody who might never in a million years want to tell a Moth story, like stand on stage, will read this book. I keep saying my favorite reader will be the person who thinks they have no story to tell, but they're just interested in the book, realizing they have more stories than they could possibly imagine, and wanting to tell those maybe to a friend, to their child, to their grandchild, because we just believe that the more stories people tell, the better off the world will be. And so we're hoping this book will inspire people to tell stories, and also to listen to stories, to talk to your neighbors, your friends, your relatives. The next time you find yourself at a snoozy family reunion, like go over and talk to Aunt, Ida May or whoever it is, and like start asking questions.
Some people tell stories in the most boring way, so that can be a little bit of a problem sometimes. Yeah. I'm struck by 2 thoughts. One is, I feel like you should tell the audience the story of how the Moth came to be, because probably a lot of people don't know it. So it'd be nice to hear the story about George.
Yeah. Okay, so our founder, George Doss Green, he grew up on an island off the coast of Savannah called St. Simon's Island. And he and his friends would sit around on their friend Wanda Bullard's porch. Wanda is like, sort of like the muse of the Moth forever. And they would sit around and they would tell stories. They play poker, they drink Jack Daniels, and they would just tell these long, beautiful tales to each other. And there was a hole in the screen, and the moths would flutter around. And so they started calling themselves the Moths. So George moved to New York City in the early 90s. And he will describe how he'd go to cocktail parties. This is like at the height of the .com era, like coming in, and the people weren't really talking to each other or listening. He would describe how somebody would be talking, and you would just you felt like they were just waiting for you to stop talking so they could start talking again. At the same time, George was going to poetry slams, and sometimes at the top of a poetry slam, the poet would tell a little story about the poem, and George was like, I want a night of just the stories.
I want more of those. Yeah.
Yeah. So George decided to get all of his friends together in his loft at the time, and he invited 100 people over and picked 5 people to tell a story. And that was the very first Moth night. And that was June 6, 1997. And it was famously a little bit rocky. I mean, everyone who's there says people just kind of went on and on. There was no time limit at the time. So one of the first things they did was put in a time limit. But I think people were really charmed. They were like, there was something really magical about this, and you should keep going. And so then it moved on into a local bar, and it just grew and grew and grew. I first came to the Moth in 2000 when I first moved to the city.
Yeah, it's really pretty amazing, because I graduated from college in 1990 and then worked in book publishing. And I first became aware of George. George famously he had a big book deal. He sold a big book. I can't remember what it was called. Yeah. Molly Friedrich was his agent, and he got a lot of money. And using some of that money, he funded the Moth and the story.
For many years, he did.
Yeah. And he's like our age. He's like a guy we knew at parties. He's a lovely guy. Yeah. But it was that idea of like people on a porch telling stories is really the genesis of the Moth. And I guess what's amazing to me in hearing you talk about all this is how it's such a lovely example of a company and organization that has grown and really kept its values completely intact. At least it seems from the outside.
We definitely try. It's a huge part of what we do.
I mean, that really doesn't always happen by a long shot, right? There's usually some compromise.
Every decision we make, we have like a set of values that we look at, every few years. And when we're not sure if we should do something, we'll look at how it translates into that and what our core mission is. Because, we're lucky. There's a lot of different ways we could go and grow, and we've just tried to grow it in a way that is really organic. Like, I think we could have grown faster if we wanted to do it in a different way. I mean, there were people who early on wanted us to just sort of like franchise it, almost like McDonald's, and just like you could just pay some amount of money and have a Moth in your city. We chose not to do it, and I think that we would have gotten bigger faster if we had. But I think that it took. You needed that.
It would have been more commercial if you had done that, for sure. Yeah, no, it's really admirable to see. And then also, I think as the Moth has grown, the world of storytelling in general has grown, right? Can you talk to that a little bit? Like, why has that happened?
I would love to. I mean, I have so much to say about it. It's almost, I feel like what I have to say about it might be a little banal, but I'll tell you what I truly think, which is, so the Moth started, but it inspired so many other people to start their own storytelling organizations, first in New York, and then San Francisco, DC, and then now all around the world, there's thousands of storytelling organizations, and some of them are a little bit different. But we really think of it as a modern storytelling movement. And it came up, I think, no surprise, hand in hand with this technology age that we're in, starting even like I'm a child of the 80s with like the big blockbuster films where it's 1,000 people in a room to tell a story, but then leading us into computers and communicating our devices and social media. And that even as all of this was happening, there was this deeply human, very ancient desire to just sit quietly in a room and listen to another human being directly, not through a device, not through a camera that somebody's editing later, but to hear directly from the person to whom the story happened. And it's come up hand in hand. Of course, now I know it's a little ironic because now the vast majority of our audience, they are listening through.
They are listening
to the podcast.
But even as you said that, Katherine, I was imagining sitting in my car listening to a Moth story, and it does feel very intimate. It really does.
Yeah, like there's something when you're listening in headphones. I mean, they're literally speaking in your ear, and this is something that we had to discover kind of organically, which is what led us down the road of pursuing audio first. And we were actually a podcast before we were a radio show, which is a little bit unusual. Maybe it's not so much now, but at the time it was very odd. But we sort of proved ourselves in podcasting, and then we're able to meet our wonderful radio partners. It helped us take the show into the radio.
Amazing. And then how does this book differ from all the other books you've published?
Okay, so the first 3 books, and I'm excited, we're actually about to do the 4th like that, are all just story compilations. So you get them, and they're between somewhere between 45 and 50 stories that have been transcribed from the live, and then I like to say lightly edited on the page by us.
Right,
so
because just what you say aloud doesn't always transfer to the page.
Exactly. You're like, people stumble, they make a little mistake, and that just reads funny on the page. Or maybe something's like they make a gesture, so it's really clear on stage. You have to just tweak it a little bit, but they're edited in a way that we hope makes them sound as read, very alive. Like one of the choices that we made early on, we had a little bit of a struggle with our editor, was that we discovered that storytellers constantly change tense when they're telling a story in a way that you never would if you were just writing it. And like a common way to do it, I'll just give an example because I feel like your audience is smart and might be interested in this, is like people will start a story in the past tense, but then right when they get to a very dramatic moment, they'll just almost unconsciously switch to the present tense. And the present tense sort of acts like a zoom lens in film, bringing you right into the moment with them. And then sometimes when that moment of that very intense moment is out, they'll just naturally drop back into the past tense. And so our editor was like, you can't do that. You just have to pick a tense, stick with the tense. But we discovered that we did that. It just kind of edited the liveness right out of it.
Interesting.
And so I know. And so
I always find that kind of interesting in writing also. I feel like I kind of like when people play with tenses a little bit.
I do too.
You're not supposed to. Very okay. Also, by the way, when you say tense, I hear your Alabama accent.
Yeah, sorry. I was just down there, and so when I'm down there, it lingers quite a bit for the few days I'm back. So. Oh
my God, it's so pretty.
Oh, awesome. Yeah, when I hang out with my sister and best childhood friend, it's like forget it, forget about it. It's like it all comes out.
Wow. So there really is a storytelling movement that's kind of, because we see in our community, like in the Revel community, Wolfers, people have storytelling nights. And do you think that's all really attributable to the Moth? I think that's where it comes back to. It's fascinating.
Well, if it does, then we're really honored because we just want more and more people telling stories. And even I think when you get into something like the Wolfer and Revel, the way you guys women are on social media, where people are coming in, telling their stories, being vulnerable, being honest, and then other people are weighing in. I mean, it is that same type of thing where it's not just like somebody's going out, they're telling something really show-offy, where people are genuinely coming in and saying, this is who I am. Like, the best stories are often about our mistakes, our missteps, our questions. And you see that within this tribe.
See it all the time, of course, right? The most dramatic stories are the most kind of vulnerable, painful, right?
Totally. And it is that desire to connect, even though in this case, like, people are typing, and it's still, people are being like honest and real about their life and not putting up some kind of fake thing, so I feel like the modern storytelling movement has pushed into the rest of the world in different ways. And I'm hoping in some ways makes at least parts of the social media world a warmer place.
Yeah. Yeah, well, I think it does. I mean, I think we find that in these communities where women are sharing stories. I mean, I find, as much as I kind of want to hate Facebook, where the wolf first started, and I mean, it's changed my life in a million ways and improved my life in a million stories. So,
me too.
What about you? How often have you told a moth story?
So I got involved early on because I told a story in one of our open mic story slams. And I was the last name picked, and I won. It was way back in the day. It was 2001 when there wouldn't be enough names in the hat.
Oh, wow. I didn't know that story.
Yeah, Jennifer Hickson, who was one of the co-authors of the book. She knew I had some story that I must have told her one night in a bar, and she convinced me to put my name in the hat. So then I found out that they were doing a grand slam. It was the very first grand slam. So I was in that grand slam, and that's how I actually met the women who were then running the Moth, and just got much more involved. I ended up being a volunteer in our community program. And then eventually, in like late 2001, early 2002, was the founding artistic director, Joey Zanders, quit. And so I was hired, Leah became the artistic and executive director, and I was hired to be the producer. And then over the course of my first 2 years, I actually did tell a story on the main stage, which I'm so glad I did now, just to have that terror. It was so nerve-wracking.
Yeah, and have it behind you.
Yeah, so I told it once in New York City, and then we did a show at Summer Stage in Central Park, and I told it there. And then I actually did also tell it once. We used to do shows at the Aspen Comedy Festival. I think it was called the U.S. Comedy Arts Festival, but everyone called it the Aspen Comedy Festival. And I was like, I feel like this is a very kind of like our age thing. I was like, but I swear I was the only person in the show who wasn't there to try to get a sitcom deal. And at the time I was very single, and the whole front row were all these really, really hot boys. And I was like, why are there so many hot boys in the front row? And they're all like, well, that is the writing staff of The Onion. And I was like, I'm going to do this. And then I quit. And so, because it was just like so much pressure. But
so it was a funny story then.
Yeah. So, and now I'm really glad that I did it, because now that I spend like a lot of my days still helping people tell their stories, the fact that I've actually been up there and put myself out there is something that I've never regretted. I occasionally will tell a story now, but usually it's for somebody else's show. I found that as the Moth grew, it became harder and harder for me to tell stories at the Moth, because it just feels a little like, I'm picking myself. And I don't know. I mean, it's funny. Like a lot of guys, especially the men in the Moth community, were like, you should be telling stories. And I was like, I feel like that's maybe, but I have really loved being behind the scenes. And I think that when I occasionally tell a story in one of these other shows, it's just a little bit lower stakes for me. And so I can relax and enjoy it.
Well, that makes sense. But I have to say, like you say, telling a story as if it's so easy. Like here I am, like 50, almost 53. I've had a lot of lives. I've never told a moth story, and I think it'd be super hard to figure out what story to tell. How do people
tell? We should like talk about that. That would be really, I've thought many times that you should, and I was just like, maybe, I don't know if you would want to, but yeah, I mean, I just think that you get on the phone with one of us, and because it's our whole job to help you figure it out. And, everyone has these moments of change. I mean, we look for stories where something happened that, often we talk in the book about like the difference between an anecdote and the story is how we define it. And most people have these stories that, like, if you think about like, what are the stories if you're on a first date that that eventually, if you really like the person, you might want to tell them. What are the stories that your friends ask you to tell their friends? And sometimes these are little just crazy anecdotes. Like one of mine is the time I accidentally drove my friends. This actually was my first slam story. I drove my friend's car off a small-ish cliff, but from the passenger seat. So yes, because anyway, the car was standard and I didn't drive standard, and I turned the keys and we just went flying over the thing. So like that's one of my stories. I also tell a story about how at my wedding rehearsal dinner, they double booked it with an actual wedding. And so the bride and groom showed up in the middle of it and it was like total chaos. So, you can see how these are like the stories that you might tell at a bar, at a dinner party.
Right.
If I were to turn them into moth stories, then probably like for the rehearsal dinner story, for instance, there was a turning point.
Well,
I might not tell at a dinner party.
What's the transformation? What's the turning point in the bridal rehearsal dinner party?
Okay,
story?
so for me, for instance, like you could tell the crazy. Actually, the other groom came in, like turned a table over, threw chairs. It was really chaos with my Southern family sitting there horrified. But for me, the transformation was that we were really nervous about this wedding because I was marrying this like very Northern Jewish guy from a very liberal family. And there's my Southern Christian. I have 4 aunts and uncles. They're all ministers. Okay. One of them does social work, but it's like this very Christian family that I think was making his family nervous. And we were worried about how these two families were going to interact. I'm somebody, I am a chronic people pleaser. I've tried to recover in my 40s and 50s, but of course I really want my mother-in-law to like me, my in-laws. So here we are at the rehearsal dinner that technically, it's like the groom's, the tradition is it's his side of the family, and chaos breaks out. And honestly, what it did was it brought both families together completely. Like everyone just jumped in and tried to help, including, my in-laws, who I think could have been, very grumpy about the whole thing. They were so lovely. They were so chill. My father, I'll throw him under a bus, was like, who booked this place? I'm like, thanks, Daddy, me. But my in-laws are just so chill. And at one point, my mother-in-law, who is to this day, like, I'm so lucky I won the lottery. My mother died when I was young. My mother-in-law is the best. She came to me, she goes, I'm so sorry. There's no one with the other bride. And she seems really upset. Do you mind if I go talk to her? I'm like, please go talk to her. It was so sweet.
Oh, that is so sweet.
And everyone just came together. And so by the time, the wedding came around the next day, there was a shared experience with about a fifth of the wedding party, because we had this huge rehearsal dinner because my husband's family is like 40 people at Thanksgiving. And so, but it just created this warmth and this fun because so many people knew each other because they had this shared, albeit negative experience.
Right.
But one which I even at the time kind of found hilarious, because one of our, we debate this at the Moth, but I think it's funny when our unofficial motto is you either have a good time or you have a good story. But that's a perfect example of it. Is like, I left that night thinking, I'm going to tell the story for the rest of my life. But I think the real arc of it would be our nerves of how these two very different families were going to come together, and then seeing them come together in such a beautiful, supportive way.
Yeah. Well, I think it's obviously it's incredible skill to be able to elicit these stories from people and help them tell them, because it is hard, I think, for me, I have a hard time imagining it. So I think I would imagine lots of people have a hard time with their lives and figuring out where the stories are that are going to be interesting and compelling, and that are going to tell some sort of lesson, and that you can do under 10, and yet I see people over and over do it at the Moth. So I know it's possible. It's just like, you see people deliver babies all the time, it's possible. So I'm sure you can tell a story, right? Just like anyone can run a marathon, which also seems impossible.
Totally. We give prompts in the book, like lots and lots of prompts. And one of the things, we haven't announced this yet, but I'll share it with the community because I'm so excited about it. I hope that my marketing director doesn't kill me. But we actually, this fall, we're coming out with, it's a little card game that's called A Moth Presents a Game of Story. And it's
what a good idea.
So beautiful, Nina. I'm obsessed. I don't say this lightly. The designer who designed the two really pretty books that have like the gold covers, he designed it. It's so pretty, and there's story prompts. And of course, there's an actual game you can play where people vote. It's a little like the slams. But I honestly just hope that at Thanksgiving, people are just passing around a card. Like it's
Katherine,
just be that.
Such a good idea. We've been having some Revel nights where we play the Esther Perel game.
Oh yeah,
a little bit of prompts and questions, but it's not quite stories. I think that's a genius idea to get people to tell stories about.
We're excited about it. Yeah, Crown, our publisher, came to us and said, "You want to do this?" And it started out just like, sure, like. But then we got really into it. And if people have went to one of our open mic story slams, we have this thing where it's called audience slips. And there was like a question that the host poses to the audience. And anyone who wants to can take a sheet of paper and write their answer. It's anonymous. And the host just pull them out of their pockets and read them throughout the night. So it's a way to read stories from the crowd. And so these audience slips, questions, like we have them all. And so it's like 20 years of audience lips, 20 years of like slam themes. So each card has a little theme and a description of the theme and then questions to ask yourself.
It's going to be the best Christmas gift.
I hope so. Like we're hoping that people will use it for journal prompts. Like every morning, just pull out a card and type, you know.
Oh, it's going to be a huge success. And again, I have to say, it's what I went to before. There's something about it that is just really so organic and genuine and not like, you know, how do we, I don't know, make storytelling popular. There's something just so genuine about it from every step along the way and that's why it's worked. It's a real lesson and it's a business lesson. You guys should be like a Harvard Business School, whatever, case study at some point.
It's a credit to the audience too, you know, because I feel like Moth audiences, we see this again and again. They're just the best audiences in the world.
Yeah.
You know, you'll go to a stand-up night and it's like this feeling that the audience is just sitting there with their arms crossed. Like, what do you have to prove? What do you have to do? But at the Moth, it really feels like people come out just wanting people to do well. And the storytellers feel that and they pick up on it. And we were worried when we started, you know, when we left New York and started doing shows out of town, like how is this going to go? And we have just found again and again and again, the audiences are like this. I mean, we just like, I directed this show in Tajikistan in 2008,
Amazing.
Where nobody ever heard of them all. They're all sitting there and just the warmest audiences lighting up to these stories.
Somehow that's because the brand is communicating that. Sorry, I sound so nerdy, but I do think it's interesting.
No, I love it. Yeah.
Well, when I was a scout in my 20s, I used to represent European publishers and so I had like 16 clients and I really learned that the whole kind of personality of the company really came from the top. Like it came from the top down, like everyone. And so it's just interesting how somehow like that you can go to the furthest corner of the world and have a Moth show and have it feel like a similar experience to in New York, that it's something in the branding and the communication of the values that is done so well that people know how they're supposed to show up. It's really fabulous. It's very
I think that audiences really want to reward vulnerability and honest and genuineness.
Brene Brown, it's true. I always say that,
she's our patron saint. You know, she proves scientifically why people love the Moth.
It really is true. I say this to my kids all the time. Like, if you show up vulnerable, no one can get mad at you. Like, if you show up and say how you really feel, like you're going to be fine. But it's a hard thing to learn, but it's so true.
It is a hard thing to learn. And you occasionally, like, the person who's going to take advantage of you if you do that is not worth having in your life. And ultimately, it's not going to work out. But one of the only ways you can bomb at the Moth, actually, I think this is interesting, is to go out there and give a performance, you know, to go out and like talk at the audience and present yourself as someone who's there to like share something with them. It's like one of the groups that sometimes struggles with the Moth counterintuitively are people who do one-person shows. Not always, like they're some of our greatest storytellers, but some of them, because they're so used to just like, it's like an arrow of energy from them to the audience, as opposed to, you know, letting it kind of breathe and be almost like, you know, not literally, but a dialogue, but like energetically.
Yeah.
And so
no, I know exactly what you mean. And I've seen that. It's that I used to say to people when I used to take them to Moth shows, it's not supposed to feel performative. And if it feels performative, there's a problem. So
exactly.
Yeah. Amazing. All right. Well, everyone listening, so all the other Moth books are Moth Stories. Yes. This is the book on how to tell a story, how to do the Moth, how to become a storyteller. Yeah. And it just came out in the last couple of weeks. And as you can see, Katherine and her entire team are truly amazing. And if you want to tell a story, you should buy this book or give it to someone as a gift. And
more than 220 people contributed to the book. Like, there's excerpts and clips, and there's actually quite a number of woofers, I think. Yeah, I know Bliss Briard has a quote. Like, lots of people that we love, you know, are in there. So it really is. I keep saying that this book is a love letter from the Moth community to the world. I didn't mean to interrupt you, but I just wanted to say that, like, just shout out to everybody who was part of it.
It's really great. And everyone will all look out for the, I don't know what you call it, the game that's coming out in the fall.
I'll let everybody know when it comes out. We're really excited. Around September. Yeah.
We'll feature it. We'll do stuff with it.
It's pretty. I wish I had it here. I'd hold it up, but I think I took my one copy into the office. But yeah.
Yeah. So to the person in the audience who asked where you can find the game, you can't find it until the fall, but we will be promoting it. We'll advertise it. We'll remind you. It's just early news, early secret news that Katherine has shared with us.
Yeah. It'll be good for hopefully all those, you know, dreaded sometimes family dinners around the holidays.
I can't wait. Can't wait. All right. Well, big hug to you. This has been so fun.
Big hug to you. Thank you so much for having me on. I can't do. I'm such a fan of the podcast. You know, I was an early adopter. Shout it out. I've gotten so many people to listen, and it's just a huge thrill for me to be here. So thank you all.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. All right. We'll talk to you soon.